All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Dr. Brian Aylward. I am the Senior Director of Academic Operations here at UAGC. I'll be the host for this session, advocating for accessibility in the online university environment. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with the TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Willie Cross, Nikki Huber, and Leah Belsley to start the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you to all the folks organizing TLC and Brian and Kate for all their work in helping us get ready for this dang old thing here and all the other great presentations throughout TLC. All right, so welcome again, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about advocating for accessibility in the online university community. This topic is extremely important, and advocating for every student's experience is crucial in order to make sure that the online experience is as inclusive as possible. And maybe it's not something that we always commonly think about in terms of accessibility, but it is all encompassing, and especially in the online space, every department is actually integral to implementing changes and policies that allow for inclusivity, not just IT and not just departments like Nikki and Leah's. So we'll be discussing what our two departments do, though, at UAGC, and how we've collaborated on a specific case that opened greater accessibility options for our students. And just using that as kind of the springboard for a bit more of a conversative type presentation. We're not just here to talk at you. I am very, very lucky to be joined today by Leah and Nikki, two members of UAGC Student Access and Wellness Team, and I'll pass it to them for some quick intros.
Thanks, Willie. It's a good intro there. So I'm Leah Belsley. I'm the Student Access Wellness Manager here at UAGC.
Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm Access and Wellness Counselor here at UAGC. There's 7 other counselors in our department, and we work directly with students to determine how we can best support their learning experience through accommodations and advocacy. And sometimes that means we're forging new paths across the university, which is why we're here today. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. Feel free to post those in the chat. And Willie, I will pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's been like, it's just been a great experience working with Nikki and Lee, and it has been kind of this like long trajectory to get to this point. But that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to present at TLC, because it really is a good example, to Nikki's point, of sometimes trailblazing in situations where it's like, hey, this doesn't work. Yes, there's a lot of systems involved, but let's plow through it because it means more accessibility for the students. So I guess my little intro or what have you is I'm a member of the UAGC IT team. Many of you in the audience I've worked with directly in the past. I am the Director for Technical Resources and Support within UAGC IT. Okay. Wow, we went from a dark slide to a bright slide. Okay. My video is now like washed out all of a sudden. Okay, so we wanted to take a second here to sort of set the stage in terms of how technology systems and accessibility sort of interact, and I'll pass it back to Leah and Nikki for that.
Yeah, so I think it's important here, Willie, you mentioned it was a crucial process to kind of have everybody on board thinking about accessibility. So we kind of want to take a moment to set that stage, right? And so when we're talking about what the scope of this work is, it's really kind of important to think of it in terms of numbers. So about 1 in 4 people in the US, that's about 61 million people, or about 15% of the world's population, is considered to have a disability. There are all kinds of disabilities, some that are visible, some that are not, and each individual has a different experience with their own disability. So, and with their environment and how they interact with it on a day-to-day basis. In terms of accessibility, I thought of coming up with a really clear and simple definition for what we're looking for in terms of the work that we're talking about for today. And what we're looking about is accessibility as creating an equitable opportunity for full participation, right? Without having to ask for any type of modifications. It's really just a basic social right for everyone. So, the question is, how do we achieve access? And there's really two ways to do this. You can do it through creating an environment that is, proactively designed to work for the majority of people, or you can create effective, reasonable modifications to already existing policies, procedures, resources, and systems, and really try to redesign or reconfigure an environment that was previously inaccessible. The key here really is to integrate accessibility into discussions where systems are being designed or configured. And this step really is critical to creating those equitable environments that we're kind of talking about here today. One of the things that you can think about is when you're in discussions about procurement of a software, a service, a resource, you can ask some questions with whoever you're working with, others on your team or with a third-party vendor that you're talking to. You can ask them about, what's your accessibility commitment? Do you have an accessibility statement that we can review? How do you test for accessibility? Do you have a voluntary product accessibility template, also called a VPAT, that we can review? Those are pretty good indications when they can provide that to you, that they have a commitment to accessibility. It's not always like a 100% guarantee that the entire system would be accessible, but it's a good place to start. You could almost think of it as like an accessibility roadmap, right? So at least you might know what type of barriers are existing in the software or the system, and think about workarounds to make it a more accessible environment ahead of time. So again, in your organizations, your departments, while in that procurement phase or when you're engaged in policy and procedure development, you want to be sure to include an additional review, another layer, so to speak, by an accessibility professional. This brings, a diverse amount of experiential knowledge to this phase, and it can help you ensure that you're meeting compliance requirements. And it can also just increase positive outcomes for everybody, right? It's a good experience to be able to get into a system and just be able to use it without having to ask it to be modified or reaching out to ask for any type of assistance. So it's a great benefit to give folks a seat at the table that have that direct experience with accessibility barriers. And a few things to think about before I kick it back over to Willie is, as an organization, we're the responsible party if we employ a resource, even if it's developed by another vendor, that isn't accessible. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's really important to kind of make sure that it does uphold to our accessibility standards. And generally in higher education, we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act or Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And the other thing that I would mention too is that it's generally more cost effective to think about accessibility in the before phase, before launching. It's more expensive to go back and try to redesign or reconfigure something later on. And also litigation is always more expensive than any type of work that you would put into creating an accessible environment in the beginning. So those are just a few things that I would add to keep in mind when you're going through these types of thought processes. And I'll kick it back over to you, Willie.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. Yeah, it really comes down to just shifting the thinking from we have to add onto the system or change the system to make it accessible. The system needs to be accessible in the first place, and all those considerations need to be taken beforehand. And so leading up to that is kind of the scenario that we wanted to describe for you all that underlines this, as well as show the work that can go into having to go back and re-engineer things when they should have been more accessible in the first place. The scenario is that some of you may know over the past year there was a bringing on of the Okta multi-factor authentication system implemented for students on within UAGC, and during that implementation, which I believe was in November-December frame time of 2021, an issue with accessibility was almost immediately identified. In that the sort of, when it comes to multi-factor authentication, the authentication part is considering a second factor, whereas the first factor is your password. The second factor is this sort of, other device or other system besides your password. And there was a presupposition made during the configuration that, well, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody can use a smartphone. everybody has that ability inherently, in this day and age, which is vastly untrue, first and foremost, and also just an unfair supposition in the first place. In addition to that, the system was not configured with accessibility in mind in the first place. Even if somebody had a smartphone, what does it look like in terms of a screen reader? How what sort of time frame does somebody have to be given to respond to a prompt on their screen? Which led to the conversation about an exception process. And I'll pass it back to Leah and Nikki to talk about kind of how student access and wellness got word on this and how they proceeded from their end.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. So I'm going to dive right into what our students are experiencing. It is the most important part and why these changes were made. And that is ultimately what led to this collaboration. Willie mentioned that we received some immediate responses citing barriers to the MFA system. And he touched on a little bit with screen reading technologies. So we immediately had students disclosing inability to authenticate within a limited period of time for our visually impaired students. They typically use robust screen reading technologies that you use on a computer, not on a cell phone, right? So there was this 5-minute window, 90-second window. I think it's changed over time. And even that part, I think we've been able to adjust to the time for all students being able to authenticate within a longer time period. We have students experiencing health issues requiring care at hospitals and other facilities that don't allow cell phones. These same health issues can lead to socioeconomic considerations, including having cell phones disconnected. So we were hearing that right away. We also have a portion of our students are part of our military community with accessibility needs, and they have unique situations preventing them from having regular access to cell phones. While this is related to their job rather than disability, it is related to a diversity. So that comes through our office as well. Many students have diagnoses preventing them from being able to re-engage with the content in their course when they have to re-authenticate over and over and over again, right? So think learning disabilities or cognitive disabilities like ADHD, they are essentially experiencing a forced break in concentration when concentration for them is not secondhand. So it stops them from being able to learn in the best way that suits them. And so all of these things were coming up right away, and we were sort of triaging them and trying to navigate these situations when we realized it's becoming a bigger issue. And we need to loop someone else in. And that was Willie's team, who has, thank you for being an advocate for our students with disabilities and working with us. I'll dive into what our process looks like now from access and wellness perspective. So a student contacts us, request alternate method of authenticating, or they simply complain about their experience, and through discussion, we learn more about what their challenges are, why they're having those challenges. Is it the MFA process? Is it user error? We go through this whole process of what is it? And then we determine if the request is reasonable based on student impacts and available options. In many cases, we're finding that an alternate browser-based option will resolve the problem. In 98, 99% of the cases, that solves the issue. In addition to extending the authentication time limit, which has also been done. I don't know if that Willie can speak to. I don't know if that part was easier or more difficult than the other part, but it has been a multi-layer fix going on here. And at that point where we're able to determine that it's a reasonable accommodation, we submit a BTS ticket with details requesting that the alternate option be implemented. We provide some details there. So Willie's team knows that it's not just us, farming these situations out, but we've really been critical about it to make sure that security on the back end is always taken into consideration. And last, I will say that all students are not reaching out when they're having this issue. We run into situations where students are in passing disclose that they haven't been able to access the classroom due to multi-factor authentication. They don't call it that. They say, I use my cell phone to access my classroom and I can't get the code, or I can't, whatever it is. And they've either dropped their classes or they've stopped posting in their classroom, which turns into a larger issue across the board. Willie, I will pass it to you to talk more about the process for addressing some of these MFA issues that are coming through our office.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't honestly even have too much more to add from the process standpoint. I mean, and one of the things that I really appreciate, a point that Nikki made, and I think to even build off of it, is that like, even if we're talking about an accessibility conversation, and IT is definitely guilty of it more often than not, but like whenever we're doing anything, losing sight of the fact that like there's a student experience at the other end of it somewhere is incredibly important. And part of that like breadth of experience is going to be, you know, an accessibility consideration. So never losing sight of that is the way that we avoid situations like this one in the future. And as we're migrating to a different system for students, that's exactly, you know, who we're advocating for at this point in time as well. And really, it was just kind of a matter in terms of implementing a process to make sure that this was in place, to familiarize individuals on the IT side who interact with these systems, how to go about treating those requests, how to go about resolving them, making sure that we had, you know, accountability throughout the sort of approval process. It did kind of take arguably far too long to get the exception process in place. Once we really established an understanding, which is sometimes one of the challenges with technical systems, is just say like, listen, here's how this works now, here's why it doesn't work. How can we dig in and find out where the sources of why it was set up this way and how to set it up differently? Sometimes those processes, depending on the organization, take especially long, but to get to that endpoint with the sort of tenacity that Nikki and Lee and the other folks in that office show, that's how you end up with the result that you would have wanted in the first place, of course. And ultimately, it's just like with these sorts of things, that does require a lot of testing. It requires a lot of documentation and communicating properly, which are all very important aspects of it. But again, ultimately, not really saying, you know, it should take that long. Ultimately, again, the goal with speaking about these sorts of things in the way that we are is that, you know, that consideration from the accessibility and from the student experience standpoint should always be paramount at the very beginning of any sort of process, especially again, working with third-party vendors as well. Oh, we're running out of time. I guess I'll pass to Leigh and Nikki for one more quick rundown.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So, you know, I think it's important to mention here, even though we're running short on time, is that a lot of the triage that we did through our office and a lot of the work that Willie had to do on the back end could have been avoided if, again, somebody had done some accessibility testing prior to ever launching this. And then that experience, as we talked about, would have been just so much more inclusive for those students that reached out to our office that weren't able to access their classrooms. So that's the goal here, right? When we talk about future goals, we really just want to focus on creating equitable practices for everybody. And, you know, accessibility isn't something that's going away. There's not an end goal in sight. This is just an ongoing conversation for folks to start to get in the routine of having, right? So I think about, you know, equitable practice. We're focusing on attainment of just treatment. We're focusing on access, opportunity, you know, and progress for everybody that's involved in the community. And when we achieve this, we're identifying and removing barriers that just prevent full participation for those folks and creating a better experience. I think that my takeaway from this work, and what I hope that the call to action for folks is that you don't need to be an accessibility professional, just have the forethought and the foresight to think about these things and think about who you might reach out to on your teams to kind of get some better insight, and just ask the questions on how we can create a more inclusive and accessible environment for folks before we launch any type of policy, procedure, software, resource, that sort of thing. It really is more beneficial to the student experience when we kind of take these proactive steps ahead of time.
Absolutely. All righty. Yeah, ultimately, that, you know, we're here to advocate for our students, regardless of under which umbrella we belong. We're here to create a great experience for them, for all students across the board. And whatever it takes to get that done, it's just a matter of doing it the right way, and ideally do it the right way the first time. So yeah, we're out of time. I threw a few QR codes up for additional resources if you're interested in that. Obviously, Leigh and Nikki and the rest of their office are incredible resources. I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm sitting on my clown shoes around these two, but I guess if there's any questions, you guys can reach out to me directly as well. But yeah, Harvard University IT Digital Accessibility is a great resource that I believe Nikki came across. And then the EDUCAUSE review is also, I'm sure some are familiar with EDUCAUSE. I'm a member, and the review is just public facing articles that folks can access. But all right, I'll say thank you all for my part, and thank you, Leah, Nikki, and thank you for the TLC folks for giving us the time and the opportunity.
Thanks,
you,
guys.
for bringing us together.
That was great. I did want to open it up for any questions or anything from anybody that's participating. I know we've got a pretty large group here that joined for your presentation today. You guys did a really great job. Are there any questions from any of the participants? Feel free to unmute your mic and ask away, or you can put them in the chat if you wish as well.
Looks like we did such a fantastic job. There are no questions.
You explained everything in full detail, no questions at all.
Well, I can offer a question.
Yeah,
Can
go
you guys
for it.
hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. If there was one thing that we could have asked faculty to do that would connect accessibility with the culture of care, what would that one thing be?
That's a big question.
It
I
is.
only get to say one thing.
No, of course not. I was looking for the cherry on top, but feel free to give me the whole sundae, Leah.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, for me, I think really, again, I'll go back to that point that I mentioned, is just really to kind of keep accessibility in mind. Don't feel like you have to be an accessibility expert. Know that we're here to help you. You don't have to kind of dive in and try to find solutions. You can reach out and ask us questions. We're happy to brainstorm with folks. So that would be my takeaway, is just I'd love for people to be accessibility champions across our institution. And we do have a lot of faculty that reach out to us and ask these type of questions. And we're happy to engage and collaborate with them. It brings a smile to our faces when we have faculty reach out and ask questions related to accessibility, because ultimately we're all here to enrich the student experience. And so I think that would be my one call to action to faculty, is just know we're here, keep accessibility in mind, and know too that when you build inclusive and accessible classrooms, it really does benefit all of the students, not just the students in this specific population that we're talking about. It really does kind of improve the user experience for everybody else enrolled in the course as well too.
Wonderful.
Haley,
Accessibility champions.
Haley, I'll add to that too with regard to the culture of care. I think that we don't know what students are experiencing, and not all students disclose what is going on behind closed doors, whether that's disability, medical condition, whatever that is, right? So there's a whole subset of students out there, 1 in 4, keep that statistic that Leah mentioned in mind, have a disability or medical condition. Certainly not 1 in 4 of our students are documented with our office. So using the culture of care to sort of spread out who receives that culture of care, right? We don't know who is who and dealing with what. So apply that culture of care to each student that comes across your desk. And that's what we do in our office, right? We would hope that everybody's doing that.
Yeah, and I think
Thank
too,
you.
just to kind of even add a little bit onto that, is that especially to a point that Leah or Nikki made earlier, which is that like sometimes students don't always know exactly who to communicate with regarding their experiences. And if it just so happens that either, again, they're not always going to speak to it directly if they're experiencing something, and they may just make a comment in passing or whatever it may be. And for a faculty to be able to know, or to just be the first person that just so happens to hear that first, to know right away, you know, the team who to reach out to kind of have that addressed is really important. And
Thank you all for sharing that. Oh, I'm sorry, what was that last bit, Will?
I was just saying it's student access and wellness.
Right. I was a few minutes late to the beginning of your presentation, so thank you, Nikki, for sharing that statistic again. And it's making me think back to a presentation we all saw this morning about who is the UAG student, and there was age and race and et cetera. And I don't recall seeing maybe that statistic that you shared, but that would be an important thing to bring to mind for our teams and our faculty.
Yep, 100%.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Haley. Good to see you.
You too.
Perfect. Thank you, Haley. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Willie, Leah, and Nikki. Thank you for the audience for participating in today's session. We encourage you to attend the next keynote presentation. You can locate all that information on all upcoming presentations here through the Whova app, and enjoy the rest of TLC. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.